Hello and welcome to another episode of Trismegistus Minis. Today I'm going to talk to you about the weathering process for bone armor on marines like this Deathwing Terminator. Today we'll be talking about oil washes and chipping, so let's jump in. To get started, I've painted a Deathwing Terminator using the method I described in my previous video. In addition to the base coats, I want to make sure that before I start weathering, all of the metallics and details have been picked out and painted. In order to keep the whole model consistent, I also like to have the base finished and painted as well. For this video, I'll be working on a single model, but the process is much more efficient if you work across multiple models in a squad at the same time. At this point, it's also important to remember that any colors we have on the model will be dulled down by the weathering process. If you'd like to keep your bright colors intact in the finished product, I'd suggest going much brighter than you think you need to. In addition to that, we can always go back in and apply things like edge highlights afterwards if we need to. To get started, we're going to prepare our oil wash. This is a 1-to-1 mix of ivory black and burnt umber oil paints. Then I'm going to use odorless mineral spirits as my thinner. You can also use usual white spirits from the hardware store, but the smell will be much stronger. We're looking for a pretty watery consistency here. Even when thinned down this much, the pigments will still be pretty strong. Just make sure to mix it thoroughly. Doing this has several advantages over traditional acrylic washes. Acrylic paints dry quickly, and once they're dry, cannot be removed without damaging the model. This means once we apply a wash with acrylics, we're stuck with the end result unless we paint over it. Oil paints have a much longer work time. While oil paints can be dry to the touch fairly quickly, their cure time can take several weeks. Before we start the oil wash, we're going to make sure that the Mini is coated with a good layer of varnish. I always go with a matte varnish for these types of oil washes. A matte varnish is going to be stained more heavily by the oil paints than a gloss varnish. While we can still wipe away most of the color with solvent afterward, that staining is going to help us achieve our final color. Alright, so now it's time to apply our mixed oil wash to the model. To do this, I'm using a size 00 sable hairbrush that doesn't keep its tip anymore. An oil wash will be a little bit rough on your brushes, so you don't want to use anything nice and new for this. For this model, there are several areas that I want to avoid getting paint on. Because we're using the matte varnish, the oil is going to stain everything it touches more heavily. On this model, I have a lot of things like object source lighting effects as well as non-metallic metal. Both of those things rely on the contrast between white and black in order to sell the effect. At this point, even though the wash can be wiped off, getting it on those parts of the models would mean they're stained, and I would need to go back and reinforce the brightest colors. If you're using true metallic paints, you don't need to worry about that. In fact, the oil wash will add a lot of depth to your true metallic colors. In addition to staining the surface of the model, this oil wash will also seep into a lot of the cracks and crevices on the model and act as black lining as well. With acrylic washes, you need to make sure you're constantly working the wash to avoid things like pooling or coffee staining. However, because oil paints have such a long work time, we don't need to worry about that at all. In fact, any pools of paint we have here can be completely wiped off with thinner in the next step. The paints I've chosen for this, ivory black and burnt umber, are there to take the bone color we have and really tone it down and add some warmth and grittiness to it. But one of the great things about oil washes is that we can choose any paints we want to be a part of it. If you wanted to incorporate yellows, reds, maybe even greens, you could easily use those oil paints instead as part of the wash to get that effect. The oil paints I use were part of the cheapest beginner set at the art store. Having the ability to mix my own washes is a great part of painting, and I highly recommend that you pick up a cheap set of oil paints so you can practice stuff like this for yourself. I'm also taking some time here to apply the oil wash to the base. That's just going to help pick out some of the detail and bring everything together. Once this step is finished, I'm going to wait for an hour or two for all of the solvent to evaporate. While the Mini will no longer be wet from the solvent, the oil paint is still active and very workable. So let's set this down and then come back for the next step. So now that the oil wash has been applied and has had some time to dry, we can start wiping it off. To do this, we're going to need some cotton swabs and our odorless mineral spirits that we made the wash with. I'm going to start by dipping one end of the cotton swab into the odorless mineral spirits. When I'm working with oils, I like to leave one end wet and the other end dry. After that, we're simply going to start wiping off the oil from the model. Some oils will come off just with rubbing, but others will require the solvent to reactivate them. Just keep switching between the sides of the cotton swab and make sure that you're usually wiping in one direction. By moving the cotton swab in one consistent direction, we help to catch the idea that this is all dirt and grime that's been accumulating on the model over time. As you're going over the recessed areas, be sure to be careful with your solvent. If we add too much solvent to those spaces, it can wick the paint back up into the cotton swab, removing all of the black lining and panel lining. Usually, you also don't need to apply much pressure with the cotton swab, just rubbing at it lightly should be enough to pull off the oils. At this point, if there were parts of your models that did not get a good enough coat of varnish, you might see some of the acrylic paint starting to rub off on things like raised edges. If that happens, it's not the end of the world. Usually it will just take one more round of edge highlights to pull that back together. Acrylic paint by itself is fairly strong, and it's only areas where the paint is thin that we need to worry. As you are working your way around the model, if there are parts that are harder to reach, you can pull out the end of the cotton swab into a finer point and use that the same way. Really, there's not much else to this step. Just use the solvent to activate the oils and then wipe away. You can really leave on as much or as little as you'd like at this point. After I wipe the mini down to a point I'm happy with, I usually let it sit for another 10 or 15 minutes just to let some of that wet solvent evaporate again. Sometimes as the solvent evaporates, portions of heavier oil paint will start to become visible again, where they might not have before. If you do have multiple models going at the same time, this is where this process starts to get much more efficient. We can use all of the dry times associated with working with oils to get other models finished. Also, it's a bit wasteful, but you'll probably need to change out your cotton swab a few times throughout this process. Once they get saturated with a certain amount of oil paint, it is possible to wipe oils back onto the model. I've seen people do this technique with makeup sponges. I personally don't have any experience with them, but it seems like those can also get good results. I would avoid using things like paper towels or tissues because they can leave behind a lot of fibers in the model. And here you can see the model with the oil wash finished. It's quite a difference in tone. Overall, it's much darker, and you can also see how the highlights and shadows are unified now. Here's another model that's only had the airbrushing, and you can see the difference in tone between just the airbrushing and the oil washed model. From here, we're going to give it one more good coat of matte varnish just to dull the oil paint down a little bit more. And then it's on to the chipping stage. And now we're going to start the longest part of the weathering process, adding lots of little micro chips and scratches. Because the base shade of our model is so light, I'm only going to be doing chips in a darker color. On this model, I'm using petroleum gray from scale 75 as the chipping color. This is the same color that I used for the shadows across the model. For chipping, I like to work with fairly thick paint on a very small brush. Other than the water that's naturally between the bristles in my brush, I am not adding anything extra to the paint. In addition to that, I'm using a size 000 brush with a very fine point. This is a brush that I only use for things like chipping, fine line work, and painting eyes. The reason for this is at the scale we're working, chipping is essentially a series of very fine lines and very small dots. Following that idea of making lots of little nicks, scratches, and dots, we're going to start with the legs and find any downward facing surface. Then, you want to draw lots of little ticks and lines in the direction that the debris would be going. In this case, if we think about an explosion going off by his feet, that would send all of the debris and shrapnel blowing upward, catching all of the downward facing parts of his leg armor. As you do this, how deep the chipping goes into the armor is really up to you. I generally don't like to have too much chipping on my models. While the chipping does add a lot of detail and help to define the edges, I do like the base airbrushing to still be pretty visible. One of the main reasons I prefer to do my chipping with a brush instead of a sponge is because I can have more control and really choose and fine-tune the areas where the chipping is present. Additionally, because I've used my shadow tone as the chipping colors, in area of shadow, the chips will show less. Just like in natural light, things in shadows are obscured and you see less detail, this also helps with the chipping in this case. I like to think of each chip as adding a little bit to the model, but at the same time remembering that they compete for attention. Because of that, I don't necessarily want 3 or 4 big chips on one part of the armor. Instead, I want to have maybe one large chip to draw attention, a couple of medium ones, and then lots of little dots. That balance helps give the eye something to quickly focus on with the big chip, but then as people look more at the mini, they can see more and more smaller details coming through. You also want to be careful at this stage not to have all of your scratches coming from the same direction. While I am generally working from the ground up, we can also work in damage from different angles. All of these little nicks and scratches help to create a story. Even if your model doesn't have any context for where these came from, in your mind, if you picture this as the tip of a power sword, or a grenade going off, or a bolt round impact, it helps you to make the damage look more convincing. For areas like the knees, where I have 2 plates connecting, I like to make sure that the scratches show on both sides of the panel line. This again helps sell the armor as a cohesive thing. In general, I would always advise on the side of less is more. If you want a more grimdark styled mini, there are other weathering methods that are more effective for that. This kind of precise chipping over an oil wash stain creates a really subtle effect, but that subtle effect comes at the cost of taking more time. Once we've made enough chips and have some larger ones in place, it's time to embellish some of those larger chips. To do that, I'm going to bring in my highlight color, White Sands, from scale 75. In this case, this color isn't representing a highlight, but instead is supposed to be the primer between the gray color, which is the natural color of the ceramite armor, and the paint color, which is the Thar brown mix. In areas of large damage, I want to work in small dots of white around the edges of the scratches. This is going to help create the illusion that there are different layers of paint applied to the armor. For other chipping methods, you'll see the highlight being applied as a way to add depth to the cut. The contrast between a black line and a white line next to each other will create the idea of depth. But in this case, depth isn't really our goal. Instead of thinking of this as bright light catching on a jagged edge, we are thinking of this as another layer of paint that's being exposed. If you were working with a different color palette, you could work in any other color instead of white. In this case, because our base bone color is so bright, we need something like white that will stand out against it. As we do this, it's going to be a very back and forth action between applying dots of white and then going back in with our petroleum gray color to smooth out the transition between the different paint layers. If either the layer of white or the gray scratch look too prominent, we need to go back in with the opposite color to round that out. This white should be used very sparingly. Only your largest scratches or scratches that are particularly interestingly shaped should get it. Being such a bright value, this is immediately going to catch the eye and create a lot of attention. If we overuse this, it will make the model look very busy and very cluttered. If I had to give you a rule, I would say 1 scratch with white bits on every individual piece of the armor would be the max I would do. Now we're going to move on to some other parts of the model. As I've been painting this model, I've been putting more focus on the legs and lower half of the body. There's a few reasons for that. First, I don't like my models to be all that beaten up and damaged. Putting things on the leg helps keep it a little bit out of focus and keeps the head and chest area clean. And second, if we think about where the largest flat surfaces are on this model, it's the shins and then the top of the backpack. Those big flat areas get a lot of visual interest added from adding chips like this. So now moving on with that, I'm going to jump to the power fist. This is an area that would see a lot of action. We want to make sure that just like we did on the legs, with the power fist we're targeting the areas that would be hitting things. In this case, that's the knuckle studs, along with the edge directly in front of them. I'm working in the same manner of picking a direction and drawing lines facing it. And by doing that, again, we're building up little chips that are going to gradually add to more overall texture. For this model, the chips are really acting in place of edge highlighting. We're using this to define the differences between plates and edges of armor in the same way that you would use a brighter edge highlight. While I wouldn't do chipping like this on every model I paint, for something like this Terminator, it really adds to the overall feel of a Space Marine. If you wanted to do this on top of normal edge highlights, that would totally be okay. I'm choosing not to here just to save some time. And as you can see as I work through this fist, I'm making more larger scratches because this is a pretty active area of the model, and I'm using more of the white dotting technique to add to that. Next, we're going to take a look at an area that has some decals applied to it. Here you can see the missile rack that I've already finished painting and chipping. Like I've done with the wing symbol on the top of this, we're going to apply the same chipping to the heraldry on the Terminator's chain fist. So to do this, we're going to need to bring back our base tone. In this case, it's Thar Brown from scale 75. Just like we added in the layer of white primer previously, this time we need to show the decals color, the base color, the primer color, and then the gray color of the material itself. We don't need all of those all the time or all of those everywhere, but it's good to keep in mind what layers we're representing. In addition to those colors, I also have the same bright red I used to paint over the decal. I usually glaze over decals just to make sure the shades of red blend in more with the model. In this case, I'm starting with the bright red and just applying it as small scratches in various places. These scratches show areas where the accumulated dirt and grime has been rubbed away. Think of this as something that hit the armor, but not hard enough to damage any paint. After that, we face a challenge. The base layer of this model was applied with an airbrush. Because of that, the transition between petroleum gray and Thar Brown is pretty smooth. If we were just to take Thar Brown and chip the decal with that, it would stand out way too much. So now we have to match the shade on our palette. I've painted many Terminators at this point, so I'm pretty familiar with the ratio I would need to do to match this. But if you haven't, I would say err on the side of darker and then gradually add more of the lighter color in. Once you find the right tone, we're going to start adding some small chips to the edges of the decal. This is going to show areas where the paint has been chipped away from that heraldry. We don't need too many of these, but just breaking it up a bit will make it look more like it's part of the armor instead of something that we just applied on top of it. As we do this, we can continue to work in tones as we did previously. All of the chipping with darker colors or even incorporating the white will still apply here. As always, restraint is the name of the game. If we go overboard, we might get to a place where the decal looks too messed up and isn't easily readable to the eye. At the end of the day, these decals are also something that adds to the character of the model, and so we want to make sure that at a glance, it's still readable as to what it is. When I was working on the missile rack, I went too heavy on the weathering the first time around. To fix that, I essentially covered the whole thing in red again and restarted the process. That is to say, that even if you're not happy with the result, it's not the end of the world. Any individual piece of this armor can be masked off and resprayed with your airbrush. Any single piece can be wiped clean with a cotton swab dipped in alcohol. Virtually nothing you do can't be undone. So while it might be intimidating to take your fresh paint job and then chip away at it like this, don't worry too much. You'll get the hang of it, and in the end, I usually find that I'm more happy with how the model looks after chipping than before. Getting close to the end here, I'm just going to show you how I do the chipping on the hazard stripes of the chain fist. The chain fist itself was painted with Eclipse Gray from scale 75, so I'm going to put some of that back on the palette. And in addition to that, I'm also going to add some Tenere Yellow from scale 75 as well. This was my highlight tone on both the yellow and gray parts. So now, combining everything we did previously, we're going to remember that the yellow is the paint color on top of the gray material. So we'll start by chipping away the edges of the yellow with the gray paint. We're focusing on the bottom towards where the teeth are, just because that would attract the most damage. As we work through this, we're going to take our brighter yellow too and do some small scratches just like we did on the red. This is one of the few areas on the model I did some edge highlighting. The main reason for that is to show that the black and yellow are part of the same object and are being hit by the same light. You can see that I'm applying the chipping color on top of those edge highlights. When we move on to chipping the gray, I'm just going to work in some of the yellow and gray together and do some chips with that. And after that, I'll do some chipping on the edges in pure yellow. Tenere yellow is a very bright yellow and works well for a highlight color. I often use it to capture the warm light of the sun. And here we are at the final stages of chipping. Because this model is magnetized, I'm painting all of the weapons separately. They all have a lot of non-metallic metal and other things to do, so they're not quite ready yet. As I've been saying, I'm keeping the weathering towards the top much more subtle than I did on the legs and arms. This technique can be a bit of a slog, especially if you're going into really fine detail with it, but once you get into the groove of just adding little chips and scratches here and there, it's really not too bad. Because we're keeping our paint pretty opaque the whole time, we're really not having to go back and forth all that much. Usually one scratch or one dot is enough, and we can move on to the next one. So while the final footage plays, a few things I'd like to point out at the end. Firstly, you can take this process as far as you'd like. This model is not meant to win any competitions. You could easily push the level of detail with all of these scratches way further than I'm doing. You could also try to go in and add more depth to them. In my case, I explicitly chose not to. But that style of weathering is also pretty popular. In addition, you can also use weathering to add more color to the model than I did. Check out things like oil dot filtering. Cult of Paint has a lot of videos on that. The thoughts behind the weathering for this model are to take something that was mostly done quickly with an airbrush and then bring them up to a higher standard with relatively little glazing and edge highlighting. Instead, by doing the weathering like this, we can still add a lot of hand-painted individual touches to the model and give each model a good amount of individual attention without it being too tiring. For these models, I'm choosing to do all the metals with non-metallic metal, so each model is already getting a good amount of time and detail from that. Additionally, this doesn't just have to be a technique you use over airbrush painting. If you're trying something like slap chop or a normal base wash highlight method, this will still work perfectly well with those. And there you have it. That's my weathering method for these Deathwing Terminators. If you liked the video, please give it a like and subscribe. I'm always happy to answer questions or any other comments you might have, so please drop them below. Finally, you can find more of my stuff on Instagram if you're interested. You can find the link in the description. Once again, this has been Trismegistus Minis. Thanks for watching.